Hello and welcome back. Thank you for sticking out this long, assuming you have. Today we're going to discuss Moses and the Exodus, and we're going to be using the Lexham English Bible like always. If you want to follow along, you may find a link to it in the description. We're always asking the question, what does this story reveal about the nature of Yahweh's interaction with people? Our God is so amazing. And it's really amazing to learn what he's like and how he works with us in the actions that we see laid out in Scripture. August 17th and 18th, 1943 were a momentous day. It was the day that the Allies bombed Piemonte. This is where the Germans were building their V1 and V2 rockets. This was the heart of their research. The Allies had been studying and planning and found this location and prepped. They dropped these bombs in August. Immediately, the Germans decided to take their work underground at Mittelwerk. And they go in and they begin building out their bombs there. But to get up to speed, the Germans needed to expand the tunnels, and they needed to do it quickly. And so by November, there were 8,000 slaves actively working to expand this place and to help build the rockets. Brigadier General Hans Kammler said, "Pay no attention to the human cost. The work must go ahead and in the shortest possible time." And this is exactly what happened. Jean-Michel, a French resistance fighter, wrote about his time at Mittelwerk during this period. He describes the endless beatings, 15-hour workdays, starvation, dysentery. He described that some of the men were so exhausted that when they got back to the barracks, they didn't even make it in the door. They just collapsed out on the rocks outside and would be stepped on by the other men stumbling to find a bunk. No one had the ability to resist. There was no stand up and fight. There was no pushback. Simple survival, moving from one moment to the next, was all that was possible. This is our closest analog, I think, to what is going on in Egypt. You see, we enter the last stage of the promise. Remember, Yahweh had told Abraham, progeny, possessions, property. He had the children. He has many of them now, right? Many descendants across many nations. He had possessions. But the one thing Abraham never had was the property promised to him. And this is where this is the story where God redeems or completes that promise. As best we can tell, when Joseph rises to power in Egypt, we talked about Joseph last week, as you remember, he is serving under a pharaoh who was of a Hyksos nationality. This is one of several dynasties that were of Egypt that were actually ruled by non-Egyptians, right? Happened a few times over the millennia. And in this case, there becomes a anti-foreigner sentiment rises within the people, and a new pharaoh or a new person leads a revolution, a civil war, expelling the Hyksos and establishing a anti-foreigner policy. And during all of this fervor, they look around and what do you know? There's this huge population of Israelites, the Hebrews, who are growing at a faster rate than the native Egyptians. And this disturbs Pharaoh, right? And understandably. Um, he's got to consider the fact that if he is invaded, and this happened from time to time, that not only does he have external invaders, but he's got potential internal revolutionaries who are kind of on the outsides of their society at this juncture. And so he needs to change things. The first solution was to change the relationship between government and the Israelites. Now, in the ancient world, there would be a difference between slaves who were slaves because they were in debt and they sold themselves into slavery to pay their debts off, and then they were set free. Then there were people who were spoils of war, and these people were never, they were property and they were never going to be anything but a slave, or they didn't have an expectation of anything else. Now, Israel didn't start as spoils of war. They become this under the new policy. And it wouldn't be all at first, right? It's like Germany in the 1930s, where they start oppressing the Jews by restricting them in certain ways. And then they start giving them, okay, well, you can't have these public services, and now you can't shop here, or you can't be out after this time. And Pharaoh isn't going to just instantly go to straight slavery because, he's concerned about their rising up against him. So he would work into this a little bit. But Pharaoh's goal is to crush them, use them up. They would be too exhausted to do anything but work and die. But he even pushed them as far as Hans Himmler or Albert Speer later would do. And his work, his efforts to enslave them and crush them didn't have the intended effect. The effect it had is they became more, they had more babies. Their families grew larger and faster. The more he oppressed, the more kids they had. And again, so this isn't working. He's afraid of this rapidly growing population, and so he goes for a second, final solution. Pharaoh tries a more crafty approach. We're going to kill the baby boys and let the girls marry into the Egyptian society. Within 1 to 2 generations, let's say 30, 40 years, there would be no Jewish people left. They would just be subsumed into the Egyptian population. From a very dark and twisted point of view, this makes a ton of sense, right? Except for the whole killing all the babies part. The problem here, besides the murder of babies, is that Pharaoh, the God had made a promise to the Israelites that he was going to give them their own land. And here is Pharaoh standing squarely between God and his promise. Oops, this is not the place one wants to be. And so Yahweh has been preparing Moses 40 years in Pharaoh's court, 40 years in backside of the wilderness, and now it is time. And Yahweh said to Moses, start early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh. Look, he's going out to the water, and you must say to him. So Pharaoh's going out for his morning constitutional or whatever. Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, release my people so that they may serve me. For at this time I am sending all of my plagues to you personally, and among your servants and among your people, so that you will know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For now I could have stretched out my hand, and I could have struck you and your people with the plague, and you would have perished from the earth. But for this sake I have caused you to stand, for the sake of showing you my strength, and in order to proclaim my name in all the earth. So, can you imagine this moment? They're gone. Pharaoh's gone out, and Pharaoh. Okay, the Egyptians believed Pharaoh was a demigod. He was part man, part god, by virtue of his office. And so he's got this pantheon of gods. There's powerful beings behind him. Remember, they could turn staves into snakes. They could cause leprosy. There's power here. And Moses walks up and says, "The God of your slaves, Yahweh says, I could kill you right now, but I won't. I'm going to bring my plagues upon you and your people so that you all will know I am the greatest God. There's no one else." This is just this moment where it's like, okay, the gauntlet is thrown. And we know, right? We read our Bible. A few weeks later, Yahweh is wrapping up the destruction of Egypt. There's there's dead crops, there's destroyed crops, there's dead cattle, there's dead people, and Yahweh is going to give the 10th plague. Firstborn of everyone is going to be dead who hasn't sacrificed the lamb. And Yahweh says, I will go through the land of Egypt during the night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human to animal, and I will do punishments among all the gods of Egypt. I am Yahweh. This is an important moment. Not only do we see the destruction of people, but he did something to these false gods. Whoever these beings were, these fallen angels, they received their punishment as well. Egypt is decimated by Yahweh. At first, the elders, when Moses first shows up, the elders and the people are kind of excited by Moses, right? Hey, we get to not be slaves anymore. This is pretty cool. But then Pharaoh turns on the people even more, and they are so upset. They tell Moses, leave us alone. You're making our lives worse. Moses comes back with this amazing message from Yahweh about how Yahweh has promised Abraham and he's going to do these wonderful things for them, to be strong. And the Bible says they ignored him. They were too discouraged and worn out from their workload, and they just said, nothing, go away. These aren't people willing to fight for their freedom. These are men and women who are crushed. They just want relief, but they are not like, if we just do our jobs, maybe Pharaoh will be kind to us. This is the attitude of the people. They aren't revolutionaries. They aren't chanting in secret meetings for freedom. It would take the Egyptians to literally just force them out of the land before they would leave. And when Pharaoh released the people, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, though it was nearer. It's the close path to Palestine. Because God said, lest the people change their minds when they see the war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the desert to the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up in battle array from the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made the Israelites solemnly swear an oath, saying, God will surely attend to you, and you will take up my bones from here with you. And they set out from Succoth, and they encamped at Etham on the edge of the desert. And Yahweh was going before them by day in a column of cloud to lead them on the way by night, and a column of fire to give light to them, to go out by day and night. The column of the cloud by day and the column of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So God is protecting these people from warfare. He's going to take them the long way around, because the strongest nation in Palestine is there guarding the gateway, the main road into Palestine from Egypt. They would immediately be attacked, and they would run back to Egypt and put themselves back in slavery. We got to get this in our mind. These aren't people hunting for freedom. They just want to work and be left alone. And when Israel cries out to God, it wasn't because they were slaves, it was because of the workload. It says, and then during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of the work. And they cried out, their cry for help because of the work went up to God. If Pharaoh had simply been gentler with the people, they would have been content to work as subjects of Pharaoh, even as slaves of Pharaoh. They had houses, they had food, they had work. They were content. But Yahweh wasn't content with that. He had made a promise. He used Pharaoh to do two things. Well, probably a lot more than that, but for our purpose of what we're looking at, to make the Israelites uncomfortable, that they would cry out for rescue and they would consider an accepting rescue from this burden, and to make his glory known through all the earth. The world, this would of course encourage those in Canaan to lose heart at the coming of Israel. But it's not enough for Moses just to speak for Yahweh. The people didn't really trust him. They didn't know him, right? He spent 40 years in court and then 40 years in the wilderness, and he shows up out of the desert, this 80-year-old guy. And probably many had heard of him and how the princess had rescued him and taken him to the court and all that. But he was an outsider. And frankly, because he had had a cushy life in the court as opposed to working as a slave, there's probably a lot of distrust. So Yahweh does the unimaginable. He reveals himself to the people 24 by 7, 365. Every day, all year, for decades. He manifests himself as a pillar of smoke during day and fire at night. They could see where Yahweh was all the time. Let's make sure we're on the same page here. Yahweh is the creator of the universe. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere, all the time. He's not like the Egyptian gods who can only be in one place at one time. And yet he chooses to manifest himself. This is literally an incarnation of Yahweh. Why smoke and fire? Despite the odd wording in a few verses, this isn't two pillars. This is one pillar that appears as a cloud during the day and as a fire at night. Why? Well, people speculate. It's possible that in the daytime it's easier to look at, you're walking across the desert. It's easier to look at a cloud, and at night there's light. Yahweh becomes a lamp unto their feet, a light to their path. Whether they traveled in the dark, and they sometimes did, or encamped for the night, they would have all the light they needed all the time. They could always see where Yahweh was. You understand? Does that not blow your mind? Think about what it means to see the creator of the universe visibly manifest before you. He leads the way forward. Now he stopped, and now it's time to rest. He's so close, so evident everywhere. Why would he do this? Why? For all indications, the Israelites weren't all that spiritual. No, at least not for Yahweh. I would expect that you would find many of them worship the Egyptian gods. Consider the golden calf incident, right? The form of worship was, their form of worship was defined by how the Egyptians worshiped their gods. They created an idol and they worshipped it in a licentious manner. Read any history on Egyptian worship and do your best not to blush. It's bad. And the people tried to worship Yahweh in the manner which they had observed and learned. So why show himself this way? Why do this? I expect that there's at least three reasons. One, reassurance. Slaves set free and led into the wilderness. What do they know about marching across the desert? They've been slaves probably for generations. certainly a long time. There's this great fear and worry about how they would survive. They weren't native to the desert. They don't know the best way to find water or grow crops or handle the animals. So seeing God literally walking before you give you reassurance that maybe it's going to be okay. And learning trust, right? Seeing God lead them would build trust in him. And they didn't trust Moses or know him yet, but they would begin to learn to trust him because of his relationship with the God that they can see. Or no man sees God's face, but this manifestation of God. And direction, like which way do we go? Yahweh is leading. He's communicating their direction, when to go, when to stop. There's no debate. There's no committee. There's no group of people looking at Moses and going, well, I think we need to go this direction instead. This looks better. No, you just go where God leads. All they had to do was follow. Yahweh's not done with Egypt, though. Yahweh prepares a trap. They set out from Succoth and they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. Okay, so they're going to sit here at the edge of the desert. And so, as you can see here, probably the orange line is the most likely. They leave, Moses leaves from Pharaoh's court, and they probably go, Goshen was where the Israelites were predominantly living. He's going to pick them up, and they're going to go, and they go to the edge of the desert. We don't know quite where all the pieces are. And they're going to turn back from the desert back north or northeast into the edge of the sea. Okay? So it says here, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites so that they turn and encamp before Pi Hiroth, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Zephon, which is opposite it. You will camp by the sea. And Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering around the land. The desert has closed in on them. And I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, and he will chase after them. And I will be glorified through Pharaoh and through all of his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. And they did so. So here's the idea. Yahweh leads them like they're going to flee directly into the wilderness. And they stop, and then they turn around and they run a different direction, and they run right into the water. Now, this isn't they're gonna go and be like, there's these two mountains, and they're all gonna cram in between the two mountains right up against the shore, trapped. Uh, this doesn't all take place in one night. This wasn't like they walked out of Egypt and head to the desert and then turn around and headed back, and it's one day or whatever. This could be the course of a couple of weeks. There's only so fast you can move with that many people and animals and stuff. So people are reporting back where they are and what they're doing. Have you ever seen a panicked animal? They run in bizarre and unpredictable manners and in just chaos. One morning, many years ago, we had a puppy that really had to go to the bathroom. It was like 3 in the morning. So I get out of bed and I stumble to the back door. I open the door, flip on the back light, and take the dog outside. And there was a possum in the backyard. And it panicked with the light shining on and me coming out the door with the dog. That possum took off for the woods, smacked straight into the side of my shed, tried to climb the shed before finally running around and off into the woods. It was pretty funny. Um, but it was this moment of the pure terror. It blindly ran into stuff, trying to escape. Dog, for his part, never even noticed. You to find the dog. Tell you what. Um, Animals do this. They panic, right? They run around in various directions looking for shelter. And Yahweh leads the Israelites deliberately in a manner that makes them look just like panicked animals, running to the desert, seeing it as impenetrable, running another direction, all the while staying close to Egypt. Pharaoh's response is, they're trapped. I gotta ask the question, why would Pharaoh chase them? Hadn't he suffered enough? Now, I mean, I understand that Yahweh said he would harden Pharaoh's heart, that he could gain even more glory over Pharaoh. But what was Pharaoh's motivation? Because it wasn't like God leaned in there and just like, you will do this, and Pharaoh just said, I will do this. It's not like that. Pharaoh's he's going to talk to his advisors. He's going to come to a decision, and Yahweh, we see it elsewhere in Scripture as well, where Yahweh will lean in with advisors and things, people and circumstances to motivate a decision to go the way that is in his plan. This reminds me of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Remember how Yahweh told Solomon that he would rip the country in two? And he did that through Rehoboam's action. Rehoboam comes before the people and they say, lighten the burden your dad put on us and we will serve you forever. And so he asked his dad's advisors and they're all like, yeah, listen to the people. He asked his friends and his friends were like, no, we're going to be so much harder on them. We're going to tax them more and all the rest. And so he takes the bad advice. And the outcome is exactly what Yahweh promised would happen. In the same way, one wonders why Pharaoh, after Yahweh had destroyed his own Egypt, would chase after these people. Pharaoh must have assumed that Yahweh was like Ra and Osiris and Isis. Yahweh is nothing like these created beings. There's this whole pantheon of beings out there that the Egyptians followed. They're not omniscient. They weren't omnipresent. There's an enlightening moment in one of the kings where an enemy, I think it was Syria, trying to invade Israel, keeps changing. Well, maybe we'll go to the forest. Maybe we'll go to the hills. Maybe we'll go to the valleys, looking for one of the gods of those areas to help him win over Israel. And this, there may be that he's thinking, okay, well, maybe Yahweh doesn't have power there. That's why they're running around. And Pharaoh's gods were capricious at the best of times, and they weren't even always available, even to their favored people. Maybe they would show up, maybe they wouldn't. You just kind of had to hope. And the rebuilding of Egypt was going to require lots of slave labor. They were watching these people run around and just, okay, you know what? We can bring them back. And he's not wrong, right? They would have come back if Yahweh had permitted it. Finally, there may have been some fear that the Israelites, having just come out of Egypt, would be willing to go back with another country as an invading force. Which, the Philistines did attempt to invade Egypt at least once. The Nubians did successfully invade Egypt. This happened. So, but whatever the reason is, ultimately Yahweh led Pharaoh to the decision to chase after. And it says, and the Pharaoh approached, and the Israelites lifted up their eyes, and there were the Egyptians traveling after them, and they were afraid, very afraid. And the Israelites cried out to Yahweh. They said to Moses, because there are no graves in Egypt, is this why you have taken us to die in the desert? What is this you have done to us by bringing us out from Egypt? Isn't this the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone so that we can serve the Egyptians? Because serving Egypt is better than dying in the desert. And Moses said to the people, you must not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today, because the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. And Yahweh will fight for you, and you must be quiet. An amazing speech by Moses. Stand still and see the salvation of Yahweh. Watch as he fights for you. These people are like a trembling animal, terrified, trapped, ready to bolt or play dead. Like a dog who's been beaten by other people, and you come to them and they just shake, waiting to see if you're going to strike them or pet them. And no, look at their lack of understanding. We would welcome death because it means freedom from our sinful selves and rescue in heaven with our Savior. These people, they're terrified of death. Israel's going to learn an important lesson here. Yahweh will protect them, lead them, provide for them. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Speak to the Israelites so that they set out. And you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it so the Israelites can go in the middle of the sea on the dry land. As for me, look, I am about to harden the heart of the Egyptians so that they can come after them, so that they come after them. And I will display my glory through Pharaoh and through all of his army, through his chariots and through his charioteers. And the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I display my glory through Pharaoh, through his chariots and through his charioteers." Can you picture this here? Lift up your staff and split the sea in halves. The ocean floor will dry up for you. What? That's not how water works. That's not how any of this works. I mean, sure, Yahweh can do this, but I am absolutely certain Moses has figured Yahweh was just going to, do what he did to the first one, go through and just wipe them all out. Poof, they're all dead. But hold up my staff and the sea will just split open and we can just start marching? It will dry up? Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if Moses felt a little bit absurd holding his staff out over the sea. He could transform his hand into a leper's hand. He could make his staff into a snake. I don't know, right? Maybe he was just like, yeah, okay, cool, I'll do it. But some part of me is, this is unheard of. Now, I want to bring you to a couple of verses that transformed how I understand the Old Testament. And the angel of God, who was going before the camp of Israel, set out and went behind them. And the column of cloud set out ahead of them, and it stood still behind them, so that it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And it was a dark cloud, but it gave light to the night, so that neither approached the other all night. Maybe this doesn't mean anything to you at this point. We've been talking so much about seeing God active. But as this idea was first coming, and I was first beginning to really understand it, I came to this passage, and I see that God manifests in this fire, he's at the edge of the water, he goes around behind them and stands still. This was God moving. He was there, and he's present, and he's interactive with them. And you may be looking at me like, is this really stood out? Yes, it did. This was the moment where I saw the life. It came to life to me. Watching God walk around. Put yourself in their position. Yahweh leads them up to the sea into a box where they appear trapped. Pharaoh is coming behind them with his world-renowned army and his mighty chariots that are the peak of warfare at the time. This was the most powerful army in the world. There's no escape. The poor broken refugees have chosen solace in a tactically foolish position. No way out. Overwhelming numbers are in front of them. It's all over. And Yahweh went behind them. Do you see this? Do you see he's right there with the people? He goes from leading to becoming a shield. He stands in the gap between the mountains. He places himself as a bulwark between his people and the Egyptians. Thus far, no further. Greatest military on earth is stopped dead in its tracks, but Pharaoh doesn't realize he's a dead man walking. He's just got to figure out how to get around this annoying fire, get to his prey. And notice this, so that neither side approached the other all night. This makes no sense. If the Israelites were seeking freedom, of course they're not going back, but they were willing and kind of wanted to go back. It was safer to go surrender. And so what Yahweh has done, he's made it so that neither side, one can't invade the people, the other can't surrender. They can't go back to the old way of living. I want to pause here a second. Time is escaping, but I want to focus for a moment in the idea that Yahweh is demonstrating biblical fatherhood and being a husband. He stands in the gap. The idea is the wall is broken and the enemy can invade. And so a man places himself to stand in the gap, to defend, even with his own body, the wall and prevent the enemy from invading his home, invading his people. You don't just casually stand in the gap. It's the ultimate sacrifice. And this just isn't about physical danger. This is about spiritual danger too, right? A husband and father makes the decisions to constrain what is allowed to enter the home and secures his family from threats that could lead them astray. There's a lot of false teachers out there who sound really good, but the father should be ensuring that his family is not led astray by these teachers. He is responsible to have the wisdom and the Bible understanding to guide his family. He is a shield. When the enemy seek him, they turn. They see someone who can and will stop their attacks. Your family, men, should rest securely in the knowledge that you are seeking their good, and the world should see it. And he prevents his family from running into the world, right? Some children will reject God. There's nothing you can do about it. And the Puritans centuries ago wrote about this, and that it's not a condemnation of the parents. But that caveat aside, we are to stand there and prevent our children who have hearts seeking wickedness, prevent them from being able to fulfill that wickedness. We, like Yahweh, are the bulwark preventing the world from destroying our family and our family running to the world. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh moved the sea with a strong east wind all night, and he made the sea become dry ground, and the waters were divided. And the Israelites entered the middle of the sea on dry land, and uh, um, the Egyptians gave chase. They entered after them, and the horses and chariots and charioteers into the middle of the sea. And during the morning watch, Yahweh looked down to the Egyptian camp from in the column of fire and cloud, and he threw the Egyptian camp into panic. And he removed the wheels of their chariots, so they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "We must flee away from Israel because Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt." I love this, right? Yahweh's blocking Pharaoh, and Pharaoh can watch them escaping through the ocean. I don't know what Pharaoh was thinking at this point, but any rational person would walk away. The people split an ocean. They're walking on dry ground. I'm pretty sure this is what we define as an existential threat. What kind of person is so arrogant or so self-confident that he would chase directly into the maelstrom, defying the God of Israel? He clearly knew what Yahweh could do. It was on display everywhere. He's right there. It was clear at his dinner table with his son dead, an empty chair. Maybe his gods were angry at their punishment, and so they were driving them forward. Um, Maybe Pharaoh's gods were missing in action. I don't know. And so he was desperately trying to rescue something, to restore things. What I do know is that Yahweh prods him forth with this panic, drive them into the river, into the sea. Can you imagine the emotional impact of all of this on Israel? slaves being crushed. They just want to live their lives and work and prevent, the overwhelming punishment and tax. Just let us alone. They, this people, they don't want to leave. They find themselves forced into the wilderness, terrified, wandering. Doom is coming, end is going to be here, and now there's this sea has opened up. This has never been dreamt of in all of history. No one looks to the sea and expects it to give way. The sea is large, it's terrifying. I've not spent time out in the middle of the ocean, but I have read that it can strip away your sanity just seeing the vastness of death all around you. And all you got is this little boat between you and certain agonizing death. And how many of them slept that night? Probably not many. Would you sleep watching the ocean? The sun rises, the seabed is dry. Okay, so this is the part of the splitting of the sea that blows my mind. It was dry ground. I couldn't figure out how deep sediment goes, but it's got to be a foot or so, right? Even if it's 6 inches, that doesn't dry in a few hours. That takes a while. The water is water soaked and waterlogged all the way down, and yet they could go. Uh, that just boggles the mind. So these fragile and terrified people, they can't get the Pharaoh to surrender because Yahweh is preventing it. On the other hand, they now have a way forward, so they go. As they walk, water towering on each side. This isn't, you imagine seeing the animals swimming around, the fish, whatever. Like, this isn't, 3-inch glass walls of an aquarium you could stick your finger in. Not that probably anybody did, right? Afraid that they would break something and it would all come crashing down on them. Probably there was that kid who wanted to poke his hand in, and the parents like, "Don't do that, you'll kill us all." But overall, I suspect they stayed far away from the walls and they went straight through as fast as possible. And it would take them all day, right? They're going and they're going and they come out. And the Bible says that it's in the morning, in the wee hours of the morning before daybreak, that Pharaoh finally released to chase the people. And once they're in the middle, Yahweh looks down and brings this great panic upon them. Their chariot wheels begin to fall off, and they are trapped in the center, too far to reach either end. And he tells Moses to lift his hands over the ocean. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, let the waters return over the Egyptians, over their chariots, and over their charioteers." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned at daybreak to its normal level. And the Egyptians were fleeing because of it. Yahweh swept the Egyptians into the middle of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the charioteers and all the army of Pharaoh coming after them into the sea. Not even one survived among them. But the Israelites walked on the dry land in the middle of the sea, and their waters were a wall for them on their right and on their left. And Yahweh saved Israel on that day from the hand of Egypt, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And Israel saw the great hand that Yahweh displayed against Egypt, and the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in Moses his servant. Standing there, piled up against the beach on the other side, and watching the waves crash down on the Egyptians and the greatest army on earth being destroyed. As they stand there singing, as they stand there just in awe, they start to see the chariots wash up and the corpses wash up. And they see and they know that Egypt didn't survive. The entire army is dead. Isn't God amazing? As we wrap this up, I want to encourage you to consider God's actions when you read Scripture. Don't go casually through it. And when it says that God said, or God went, or God did, pay attention. Because God is not far off. He is not ignoring them. And as we looked at last week, even when he's not doing these great, amazing things, when we looked at Joseph, God is still working, even if it's discreetly. He is still making his will come true. He is still shepherding it. And he cares for the downtrodden. Consider how he cares for you and I. He does not leave us to neglect. He doesn't walk away and hope we succeed at following his will, or his will, maybe hopefully he's rolled the dice and it comes up. Yahweh shepherds his will, and in so doing, while he does it, he cares for you personally.